I want to sincerely thank the Office of Ceann Comhairle for allowing me to raise this very important issue, the whole issue of adoption and inter-country adoption between Ireland and Ethiopia. The issue that I want to raise to the Minister is the difficulty that is currently being experienced by people who want to adopt children from Ethiopia, and because of the absence of a bilateral agreement with Ethiopia, there is huge difficulty in doing that. The enactment of recent legislation in the area, whilst is welcome by and large, it has effectively meant and made it impossible for Irish couples to adopt Ethiopian children. Now, not only does this pose obvious problems for first-time or prospective adopting parents seeking to adopt from Ethiopia, it also means that Irish couples who have previously adopted a child from Ethiopia, who may want to expand their family, adopt a second child, these people are also in that very difficult space at the moment. And it is in this context, Cathaoirleach, that I am calling on the Minister to review the situation and specifically to begin negotiations with the Irish-Ethiopian Adoption Organisation with a clear view to establishing a bilateral agreement between both countries. This country has a very positive experience and a very positive history of adoption from Ethiopia, going back for 20 years. Most recent figures indicate that between 250 and 300 Ethiopian adoptions have taken place in Ireland over this period of time. There are now an estimated 7 million orphans in Ethiopia, and of that figure, Cathaoirleach, just over 3,000 Ethiopian orphans are involved in inter-county adoptions. Now, we have a duty to reach out to a country like Ethiopia, where there are 80 million people. We're facing into a very difficult budget. Our country is experiencing a lot of difficulty economically and socially, but a country like Ethiopia, I think, in the global context, our worries probably pale into insignificance when you consider the critical issues that affect that country in terms of inequality, in terms of poor education, health, shelter, sanitation, and all of these areas are not improving, they're getting worse. Just 17% of the country is urbanised, and it has the single biggest difficulty with youth unemployment than anywhere else on the planet. And over 1 million people have AIDS or HIV in a country that has also had its well-publicised share of conflict in the past. I want to in particular mention the Hague Convention, and as the Minister is no doubt aware, we ratified the Hague Convention on the protection of children and cooperation in respect of inter-country adoptions in 2010. The enacting legislation, which was the Adoption Act 2010, came into force on the 1st of November last year. Now, the Hague Convention establishes minimum standards for the protection of children and eliminates various abuses previously associated with the inter-country adoption process. And it is in this context the ratification of the Convention and the accompanying legislation are to be roundly welcomed, because it ensures that high standards and specifications are applied to the inter-country adoption process at all times, and it places the best interests of the child above all else. Section 40 of the Adoption Act stipulates that in respect of inter-country adoptions, only children from contracting states may be adopted by Irish couples. The only other avenue whereby Irish couples may adopt children is if they come from a country that has a bilateral agreement with Ireland. At present, Ethiopia's limited resources mean it has been unable to ratify the Hague Convention. Therefore, for adoptions to continue into Ireland from Ethiopia, a bilateral agreement between the countries must be put in place as required by the Adoption Act. It's important to point out that the Hague Convention does allow for adoptions to non-Hague countries, and as I have just mentioned, the Adoption Act of 2010 allows for bilateral agreements with non-Hague countries. And as far as I understand it, Ireland is the only country which has restricted adoptions to Hague countries only, and who will not allow adoptions carried out to Hague standards from non-contracting states with a bilateral agreement. Now, significantly, Cathaoirleach, countries where the Hague Convention is enacted, such as the UK, Belgium, Norway, Sweden and Germany, facilitate adoptions from Ethiopia despite the fact that Ethiopia has not ratified the Hague Convention. Now, furthermore, Australia has a bilateral agreement with Ethiopia, and I believe this is applicable and is mirrored in terms of our own situation. It can be mirrored in terms of our own situation here in Ireland. While Ireland presently has no bilateral agreements, history shows us that the now expired bilateral agreement with Vietnam was an exceptionally positive collaboration, and therefore there is no reason why an equally productive link cannot be established with Ethiopia. In conclusion, Cathaoirleach, a point worth noting, Minister, is that worldwide 80% of all inter-country adoptions are from non-Hague countries, and only 20% are from Hague countries. There are many, many families in Ireland who are, for one reason or another, seeking to adopt an Ethiopian child, but are being prevented from doing so. Now, there's a very, very easy remedy to that situation. And in conclusion, I want to call on the Minister, your colleague Minister Fitzgerald, I want to call on the Minister for Health and for the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs to agree to a request from the Irish Ethiopian Adoption Organisation to have a meeting with the Minister and to authorise the Adoption Authority to commence negotiations with the Ethiopian authorities on the matter of establishing a bilateral agreement with Ireland. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you. Minister for Social Protection, George Burton, to reply on behalf of our colleague.
I want to thank Deputy McCarthy for raising this matter, which I appreciate is of great interest to many members of the House. And I will be taking this adjournment on behalf of my colleague, Minister Francis Fitzgerald. The 1st of November 2010 saw a fundamental change to adoption in Ireland with the commencement of the Adoption Act 2010 and the coming into force of the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption. In terms of inter-country adoption, Ireland has now signed and ratified the Hague Convention, which aims to promote the highest standards and best practices in inter-country adoption. The practice of inter-country adoption is not without risk. The Hague Convention seeks to minimise the risks, with Hague countries working in collaboration to build confidence in the process in both sending and receiving countries. The Adoption Authority of Ireland, the AAI, is the central authority for Ireland as regards inter-country adoption. As the Hague Convention is designed to ensure a minimum set of standards to inter-country adoption, the Adoption Authority of Ireland has indicated that their first priority is to reach agreements or arrangements with other Hague countries. The AAI have recently returned from the USA and now intend to develop an administrative arrangement with the USA for inter-country adoption. In the coming weeks, they also intend to visit Mexico and Vietnam in the context of entering into administrative arrangements with both of these jurisdictions, the latter being dependent on the entering into force of the Hague Convention in Vietnam on the 1st of February 2012. The Minister has been informed by the Irish Embassy in Addis Ababa, and I think it's helpful that there is an Irish Embassy in Addis Ababa, that the Ethiopian government is strongly committed to protecting the best interests of the child, and that the ratification of the Hague Convention is an objective for the Ethiopian authorities. While the Ethiopian authorities are supportive of the goal of Hague compliance, it seems likely that it will take time for them to put in place arrangements to allow for the ratification of Hague. UNICEF is working closely with the Ethiopian authorities to support the development of enhanced policies and programmes in support of children. As well as providing for the ratification of the Convention, the Adoption Act also provides that we may enter into bilateral agreements, as Deputy McCarthy has noted, with countries who have not ratified Hague, such as Ethiopia. The negotiation of bilateral agreements on inter-country adoptions with states who have not ratified the Hague Convention is governed by Section 73 of the Adoption Act of 2010, which states that the authority, with the prior consent of the Minister, may enter into discussions with any non-contracting state concerning the possibility of the government entering into a bilateral agreement with that state. The opening of negotiations on such a bilateral would need an analysis of the current situation regarding adoptions in Ethiopia, issues regarding the compatibility of the laws between the two countries, and the plans of that jurisdiction vis-à-vis the Hague Convention. In the context of Ethiopia, the Adoption Authority of Ireland have given preliminary indications that certain issues are likely to arise that will require detailed consideration, especially issues relating to the effect of Ethiopian adoptions in the context of the Adoption Act of 2010. It is also acknowledged that the adoption process is a tremendously emotional journey to which legal rigour has to be applied, in the best interest particularly of the child, but in the best interest of all the parties to an adoption. Add to this process the period of change that the Adoption Act has induced, and the result is a demanding landscape for prospective adoptive parents. There are few certainties or guarantees, and on occasion governments both in sending and receiving countries may make decisions about what is in the best interest of children that will leave prospective adoptive parents concerned. The Minister is extremely conscious that the authority has a full work programme in terms of Hague countries, as well as the important upcoming priority engagement with Vietnam. In addition, the authority and the officials in the Department of Children and Youth Affairs will be undertaking exploratory meetings with the Russian authorities in the coming weeks. The authority must also prioritise checks of legal compatibility with a wide range of jurisdictions in order to process applications for the recognition of the adoption of children already adopted from abroad by Irish citizens. These are desktop reviews requiring legal advice, but are urgently required to regulate the status of children who have already been adopted. Minister Fitzgerald has sought an update on Ethiopia from the Adoption Authority and the Irish Embassy in Ethiopia in order to assess possible next steps vis-à-vis that jurisdiction. However, further action also has to have regard to the wider work programme of the Adoption Authority and their agreed priorities.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy McCarthy, for
Thank you, Colonel. Sorry?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I thank Mr Burton for taking the topical issues. Minister, there's, as is obvious from the reply, there's a legislative framework which will allow the inter-country adoptions to take place by virtue of leaving aside the difficulties Ethiopia may be experiencing in terms of ratifying Hague. But there's a legislative framework and a provision there to allow us to proceed with a bilateral agreement. Now, we have the embassy in Addis Ababa, and I am happy to see that the Minister has sought an update, and also from the Adoption Authority. But there are two specific requests. The first is this: I would urge the Minister concerned, Minister Fitzgerald, to meet the Irish-Ethiopian Adoption Association and to thrash out the remaining issues. And secondly, to fulfil what is only right and proper, and that is to allow the bilateral to take place so that we can promote families coming together, that we can allow people in this country who want to adopt an Ethiopian baby the joy and happiness that will so importantly and significantly bring to people's lives. But it will also allow people who have already adopted children from that country to expand their family and develop their family unit. We are living in very difficult times, and this certainly is a very good news story, but it's a good story for children, it's a good story for families, and it is something that I believe that government need to pursue with a great degree of enthusiasm, compassion and speed. The apparatus is there, the legislative framework is there. What we need is a political push, Minister. We do have an embassy in Addis Ababa. You've spent a significant period of your own life in that continent. You know the difficult social and economic issues that are challenging the very livelihood of people in Ethiopia. And I would urge you, Minister, to urge government and your colleague to pursue this issue. And I would respectfully ask that Minister Fitzgerald would get back to me following the update that she has sought herself from the Irish Embassy in Ethiopia, and looking at the possible next step, because look, the framework is there and we need to push it in that direction.
I will certainly ask my colleague Minister Minister Fitzgerald to give fairly urgent consideration to the meeting that you suggest with the Irish people interested in adopting from Ethiopia. As I said in the detailed reply, there is a lot of work ongoing at the moment arising from the development of the 2010 and entering into force of the 2010 Adoption Act. Also, we have as a country finally, after long years of discussion, signed up to the Hague Convention, and I think that that's actually extremely helpful. I know that there are, I've been in Ethiopia, there are unfortunately quite a number of children in orphanages. You mentioned yourself the figure of 3,000, and certainly I think there is a very strong case that where a child would otherwise spend their childhood in an orphanage, there is a very strong case for facilitating a good quality home to adoptive parents who would love that child and look after that child. And I mean, I was myself adopted, and of course Ireland has a long history in the 1950s of children going to America to be adopted in the period after the Second World War. So we're not without our own history, and those children coming back subsequently to Ireland to look for their birth roots. So I think it is important that we look at the interests of everybody here, absolutely foremostly that of the child, and as I said, the issue of a child being in an institution like an orphanage for all of their childhood, as opposed to finding a loving home. I think the fact that we have an embassy in Ethiopia is very helpful, and I will ask Minister Fitzgerald to send you the report, or a report on the briefing that she gets from the Irish Embassy. But I think Minister Fitzgerald has achieved a lot of very positive work since she took up office. And just as a matter of interest, I got a table from the officials from her department. It might be of interest. In 2011, there were 41 registrations of adoptions from Ethiopia. In 2010, 75, 2009, 21, 2008, 26. So there is a history of, and I'm sure the department will furnish you with the details of the adoptions from abroad. They're the non-Hague adoptions. So it's interesting that the total of the non-Hague adoptions so far in this table for 2011 is 135. And for 2010 was 168. So clearly, now that we've signed up to Hague, adoption is still continuing. It's just that clearly the framework has to meet the requirements of Hague, and the sending country also have to establish and meet fairly stringent requirements on their side as well. That is in the best interest of the child. But I will raise what you've said with Minister Fitzgerald.
Thank you.